Hello and welcome to LionWing Talks, a weekly show about all things LionWing. I am your host yet again, and also the president founder of LionWing, Bradley Hailstorm. Thanks for joining us today. This is episode 9. I think it's episode 9. No, it's episode 8. All right, off to a great start already. There's a reason why maybe I'm a little fuzzy headed, which I'll talk about here in a second, but thanks for joining us nevertheless. We've been doing this for 2 months now, every week, since we started this the week that our last Kickstarter campaign launched. So it's been a fun ride thus far, and in this show you can expect various things. We kind of hit similar topics each week. There's usually a question and answer session. These are questions that are submitted to me through the community in some way, social media, Discord, and then I provide answers to those things. I give you all project updates, and then I will also just kind of talk about general LionWing stuff. Now, there's also room, though, just to talk about tabletop games in general, especially when it comes to Japanese tabletop games. I'm always willing to talk Japanese tabletop games. We did a little bit of that in one of the more recent episodes. I think we were talking about sort of tabletop gaming trends, and I got into some talk about Japanese games. So that's also on the table. And of course, talking about localization is something that often happens on the show in some regard. Usually, when we pull back the curtain a little bit on what the localization process is like in the tabletop industry, or at least for our games, we tend to get good feedback. So I like doing that from time to time. But nevertheless, this show is going to be a little light on content, primarily because I've been sick since the weekend. And full disclosure, I have not had a lot of time, a lot of energy to dedicate to much of anything this week other than just trying to beat this thing. You know, this is the worst part about having kids who are in daycare. You never know what they're going to come home with. It always seems like there's some kind of ooze coming out of some part of their body. And, everyone in my house got whatever this crud was, and everyone's over it now. And so I was thinking, I was going into the weekend and I was thinking, like, I beat this thing. Like, I didn't get it this time. Everyone else got it. I didn't. I'm solid. And then it was one of those moments. It's like famous last words, right? Started feeling strange that night. Woke up the next day. I was like, oh no, it has come to claim me as well. And nevertheless, the daycare sickness is a real thing. If you have kids in daycare or have ever had kids in daycare, you know what it's like. It's not fun. Nevertheless, I'm a little bit on the mend now. I think I'm coming up on day 6, so I'm feeling much better today than I have the past 5 or 6 days. Nevertheless, so I haven't had a whole lot of time to prep for this, so it's going to be a little more of a condensed show. I apologize, but we also just didn't get a lot of questions this week. I wasn't around the Discord a whole lot, and so perhaps that played into folks not reaching out in the typical way they do. But that's okay because we've still got updates to talk about. Nevertheless, we're going to jump right into things with the primary question that I got in the Discord, and this isn't necessarily about any one of our projects, but it is about LionWing in general. And I was waiting for someone to ask this question. I figured it actually would have happened before now, not necessarily on the show, but it would have happened long before the show ever came into existence, because before LionWing was named LionWing, we were named something else, and some of our presence online, you can still see the old branding, such as on our Kickstarter. Our Kickstarter profile is under a different name. Now, yeah, our main account is called LionWing Publishing on Kickstarter, but if you actually look at the URL for each of our campaigns, you will see that it's not, LionWing Publishing / Embryo Machine. It is a different name. And so someone asked about that. Someone said, "Hey, the Kickstarter links still have what I assume to be an old name, Basement Game Boutique. Can we get the backstory on this?" Yeah, so Basement Game Boutique. That feels like a lifetime ago. Before LionWing was a thing in terms of being a company that focused strictly on localization, I was working on my own tabletop game and had been for about a year before I shifted focus to LionWing and localization. And so when I started designing my own tabletop game, I knew I needed to create some kind of, or I guess I didn't need to, but I wanted to create some kind of company branding, obviously. So I ultimately decided on the name Basement Game Boutique, which was an homage to a couple things. So most of the names that I come up with for, be it a company or something else, tend to have inspiration somewhere. They're not just sort of random words thrown together. And Basement Game Boutique came about in two ways. One, at the time, I was doing all of my game design in, well, the basement of my house at the time. And I thought it would be nice to be able to pay respect to all of the time that I've spent in this basement, away from my family, away from my wife, away from friends or family, doing this thing that I enjoy, which was designing this game. And so I kind of wanted to figure out a way to work that into the name, but more importantly, in what was a larger influence on the name, ultimately bears a little bit of a story. So a long time ago, I guess when I was maybe 13 or so, me and my best friend. No, I know we weren't that old, actually. No, we couldn't have been that old. Maybe we were like 11. We were still in that play stage, you know. But we definitely were experiencing video games kind of for the first time and finding out how much we loved the medium. And so we we had this weird thing that we did in his basement where we acted like we owned a video games. It's kind of embarrassing to talk about because it's so ridiculous. Where we acted like we owned a video game store, and one of us would act as the one of us would act as the store clerk, the sales associate, and another would act like the customer, and the customer would come up and say like, "Hey, do you have this game?" And so whoever was acting as the sales associate would then have to pull out this list, and it was a list of games that FuncoLand. If you're old like me, then you probably and you live in the States, then you probably remember FuncoLand, which eventually became Games. It got acquired by GameStop. Like 2 decades ago at this point, but nevertheless, there was a place called FuncoLand, which was basically another GameStop. They sold new and used games, but they did this thing where they would have sheets with all of their store inventory on it, and almost like check boxes where you could go down the list per console and check like which games you have already for that particular console that they had in stock. And so he and I would take these sheets and we would act like we were checking our inventory to see what games we had, and and then we'd go back and say like, "Oh yeah, I've got Batman Forever for the Sega Saturn. Sure, let me go get it for you." And then the sales associate would have to run across the basement to the back part of the basement, like this back dingy dungeon like part of my friend's basement. And we'd act like we were pulling the game from the shelf. I mean, this was like an elaborate retail store simulator that was happening. And we'd act like we grabbed the game from the shelf, and then we run back over and we'd say, "Yeah, we've got Batman Forever on Sega Saturn. Here you go." And then we'd act like we would, the transaction would take place. And it was totally fucking weird, but it was so awesome. And, along the way in life, I have forgotten many a thing, but I have never forgotten playing that simulator, the FuncoLand simulator, I'll call it. And so when I was thinking about designing my own game, I was trying to think back to all the things about gaming that had made an impression on me, and ultimately kept coming back to that silly thing my friend and I did, and I wanted to incorporate that into the name. And so that's where Basement Game Boutique came from, because it was when we were playing that silly game, it was like we were running a little boutique store, a game boutique out of his basement. So that's ultimately the primary inspiration for that name of Basement Game Boutique. And I see he's in the chat right now. Actually, he's the one that said yes, great memory. So he and I have been friends for damn near 30 years now. So anyway, it was a good memory, and that's ultimately why I chose Basement Game Boutique. But then, when I shifted to localization, I did not want to keep that for the name. That name fit when I was just kind of doing my design thing. But when I knew LionWing was going to be a fully fledged company and we were going to be taking other people's works and presenting it and doing all the localization, I wanted something a little bit more professional sounding, and then I went with LionWing. So got another question in the chat, actually from the same person who asked me the question about the basement game name. Let's see here. Obligatory question now that you mentioned it. What happened to the board game you were/are working on? Yeah, I mean, nothing has happened to it in the sense that it hasn't gone away. In fact, I was just doing some playtesting on it, I don't know, like 2 weeks ago or something. The game is actually done. I mean, the art's done, the layout's done, the balancing is done. I mean, everything's done about the game. I've just been trying to figure out what do I do with it now? How do I present it? Do I present it? Do I put it out as a LionWing product? I don't know. So I don't know what I'm going to do with it, and that's why I haven't done anything with it thus far. And it's not like it's recently been finished. I mean, it was finished like 3 years ago. So I mean, it's seriously just been sitting on the back end, and I just don't know what I want to do with it right now. Someone said you should find a company that's able to publish board games. Yeah, that I should try to find someone who can publish that kind of thing. I wonder who it could be, who's got those connections. So, but yeah, it's sort of a JRPG combat simulator, a PvP JRPG party-based combat sim type game where you have multiple characters and each characters have their own unique abilities and their own stats, defense values, attack values, speed values, all that good stuff, different gear sets that changes those stats. And it's a very sort of team synergy based type of game where you're trying to build out a party that really plays off of one another, because you've got some ranged attackers, some melee attackers, some folks who can only be positioned in the front row of the battlefield, some who can only be positioned in the back row. There are penalties depending on your positioning on the battlefield. There are elemental values to take into effect, and you can combo off elemental values, that kind of thing. I think it's a pretty cool game. It's been pretty rigorously play tested, so I feel that it's in a good spot. Like if someone was like, "Hey, you have to publish this tomorrow," I would say, "Hey, okay, I can do that. That's fine. It doesn't need any more work. It really is just sitting there." The art's pretty killer. Hired a fantastic artist to do all the character work. So the only thing that does need to be finished is the rulebook needs some graphic design work on it. That's it. Anyway, someone asked, "Is that Embryo Machine set up behind you?" Yes, it is. Yep, it's right there. If you're watching the video, if you're listening to the audio, sorry, you can't see it, but nevertheless, there is the Embryo Machine board, or one of the boards anyway, set up behind me. I pretty much always have that thing set up there because I'm always fiddling with it, especially as we're doing asset checks. We're doing pretty heavy asset checks right now. I just did another pass a couple days ago, actually. I talked about it, I think, in last week's show, that we changed some of the terminology around. Anytime that you make a term change, especially once most of your assets are more or less finished, it's a little scary because you never know, like, are there any instances that we missed along the way where the old terminology is used? That's like the stuff that my nightmares are made out of. It's not the end of the world if your game ships and there's some kind of issue like that, but to me it feels like the end of the world. So I was going through just a few days ago to make sure that the new terminology was in all of the correct places and there were no signs of the old terminology. Anyway, so late but here, said Sin Theory. Thanks, Sin. As I mentioned in last week's show, Sin is one of our new community leads. I'm going to talk about what he's going to be doing for all of you here in just a minute. If anyone ever wants to see any of Embryo Machine's components, just let me know. I'll gladly show them off here in the video. Someone Rogue said, "Glad to finally be able to catch the stream. It's the first time." Hey, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it. I'm glad you could catch it as well. It's always great to see. It's always great to see our returning folks, our regulars, and it's always awesome to see new faces, so to speak. So thanks for joining us. If you have any questions for me along the way, just drop them in the chat. Obviously, I'm monitoring the thing as we go along. Nevertheless, yeah, so let's get to some project updates. So, Kradia, Wild Hunt Festival. a little bit of an update, not a huge one, but definitely a good one. And that is just this morning, I was CC'd on an email between our fulfillment center and the printing company about verifying consignee and forwarder agent information at various distribution sites, and basically at various checkpoints along the way as the game makes its way internationally across the waters. And so that's kind of like your last stop. I mentioned in last week's show that the games are finally on the pallets, which is also pretty close to the last stop. Obviously, your games can't get onto a cargo ship without being on a giant pallet. And so it was great hearing that they were finally on the pallets. It wasn't great hearing that they weren't picked up. It was great then knowing that they weren't picked up when I thought they were going to be. It was great then hearing just this morning at like 8 a.m. That information for the forwarding agent was being sent back and forth between the two parties who needed to be communicating about that thing, that very thing. So, I mean, I've said this before, but it's always true every time that I say it. We've never been closer to getting Kratia on this damn boat. I wish it would just get on this damn boat already. I'm getting impatient. You know, I'm feeling like a backer right now. You know, I've been a backer of so many projects. I don't even know how many hundreds of projects that I've backed on Kickstarter. And so I really do know the backer experience, especially when it's a game that you're really looking forward to. I mean, hopefully every game you back, you're really looking forward to. I think you have to look forward to a game a whole lot to invest in it through a crowdfunding campaign. But certainly I think we can all agree that there are certain games that we've backed that we're a little bit more excited about than others. And I certainly have had that experience. So I know what it's like to be kind of waiting with bated breath, like, come on, let's get here. I want to play this game so badly. But we are moving forward. And that's what I like about Kratia. Although we are obviously behind schedule, we wanted to deliver these things in December. The pandemic said, yeah, sorry about your luck, but I'm doing my pandemic thing right now. So you'll have to wait in line for me to finish up. At least with Kratia, though, there's been movement along the way. Even though we were delayed, there's always been some kind of update happening. And the printing company and the fulfillment company have been very talkative. And anytime that they're not directly addressing me, I'm always looped into that email conversation. I'm always CC'd at least. And so I can see, actual movement happening. It's not like with Gun and Gun where the communication isn't super great. And so I can't really lay eyes on the process. I'll talk about that here in a second. So that's the primary update for Wild Hunt Festival. The other update is we are going to be, releasing our second DLC soon. I can't give you a better release date for that second DLC than soon, though we won't be delivering it before the games get delivered. We obviously delivered DLC pack number 1, which was the winter themed one, long before the games were due, though we thought we were going to be releasing it the same month that the games were delivered. So we had the best intentions. A winter themed DLC pack timed for a December release. Like, it doesn't get much better than that. And obviously that never actually came to pass. So talk about your dreams being dashed. Nevertheless, it's the thought that counts, right? So we had to deliver that first DLC pack before the games would obviously show up on doorsteps. But this one, we're going to wait. The DLC number 2, we're going to wait until the games actually get there. I don't think we're going to wait too much longer after the games get there to deliver that information. And I'm not sure if we're going to include the Wild Hunt Festival fan contest winners content in DLC pack 2. That hasn't been quite decided yet. My guess is because it hasn't been decided yet that Ramo-san will probably want to include it in pack 3. But, stranger things have happened, and we might decide at the very last minute, like, oh no, we can work this into DLC pack number 2. That's no issue. I know like the general theme of DLC pack number 2, but I actually don't know the content of it. So with the winter DLC, I knew from the moment that we talked about DLC what that DLC was going to entail. So I had an understanding of what was going to be in that package, I don't know, 5 months before we delivered it. This one, though, it hasn't been, that information has not been given to me yet. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Ramo-san is so freaking incredibly reliable, that I'm really just kind of like excited and wondering all the possibilities, knowing what the theme is, of what he could be including in this particular package. So someone said, was just about to ask about Kradia, backed both that and Embryo as my introduction to LionWing. Yeah, thanks so much. That's really awesome. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of folks' first foray into the LionWing catalog started with Wild Hunt Festival. I would have assumed that it would have been Testament, but I think we actually had more backers on Wild Hunt Festival than Testament. So that seems to be the popular jumping on point for our stuff, which to me, I'm like, there's no better game to kind of get into what we do and who we are and the types of games that we like and the types of games that we publish and will publish than with Wild Hunt Festival. So you got in at a good time, I guess is what I'm saying. And it's cool because, knowing you backed Embryo Machine and Wild Hunt Festival, I can't think of two games that could be any more dissimilar to one another. I mean, they're like diametrically opposed, which is great that you're getting two very, very different games. It's a balance as a publishing company. You want to make sure that all of your games feel like your company. That's something that I think about all the time. Like when I'm scouting games, I'm like, can this be a LionWing game? Like if someone saw this at retail, they saw the box, would they immediately think, without looking at that logo in the corner, would they think like, oh, I bet that's a LionWing game? And so I always want people to sort of recognize the type of game that we would do. But at the same time, you never want your stuff to be too samey. So it's this delicate balance that you have to find of like, how do you make sure all of your games sort of have a through line that connects them in some way, but also offer enough game diversity to make sure that people aren't buying the same game over and over just with a new skin. I mean, that was my biggest concern, to be completely transparent. That was my biggest concern with launching Testament and Wild Hunt Festival back to back. They are very similar games. Now they look completely differently. And ultimately when you get into the nuance of the mechanics, they feel very, very, very different. But, on paper, they're both boss battlers. They both are, they have a fantasy setting. They're both character-based, hero-based. Heroes have unique abilities. So that was one of those things where I'm like, oh, are people going to want both games? I just, came to the conclusion, yeah, they're different enough where I think people will want to play both. I'm sure there are some people who are like, no, I got Testament, I don't need Wild Hunt Festival. And there will be some people who are like, I got Wild Hunt Festival, I don't need Testament. That's fine. Nevertheless, it is something that I think about often. Sin Theory in the chat said, I started with Kradia, thank you, went all the way to Embryo, and then back to Cynomia and Testament. Yeah, so you kind of did a backward tour through our catalog, which is totally fine. I mean, no one knew about us, really, until Testament. And even then, because Testament was flown under the Japanime banner for the Kickstarter, we are the localization studio and we're billed as the co-publisher, but we were primarily the localization studio. Japanime is handling everything else. So I think a lot of people assume that's a Japanime game. And in some ways it totally is. Their name's on the box. They helped publish it. They're going to be handling all the logistics. They handled not a lot, but they handled some of the upfront money cost and that kind of thing. And absolutely, they deserve to be on the box. But I always say to myself, and I think I've even said to other people, like it is a LionWing game. That being said, I think the majority of people really kind of jumped on with Wild Hunt Festival, and that's when people started noticing LionWing. So I ultimately say all that to say, Sin, that your journey through our catalog isn't all that, unlike others. I've seen a lot of folks who have backed Gun and Embryo Machine and then said like, oh yeah, you've got this game called Cinema Coliseum. That looks interesting. I'm going to get that too. So that seems to be sort of a common thing here. And then someone in the chat said, and here I am mostly excited about Gun. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Gun and Gun's awesome. It does seem like, and this is just an observation, and this might also change once the games get out into circulation, but it does seem like Gun is the one that people talk about the least. Embryo gets a lot of attention because it's the newest. It's the newest baby, so it's the newest shiny toy, so everyone focuses on that. Or they focus on, Wild Hunt Festival because it was their first one that they got in on. Or you've got the old timers who are like, oh no, it's Sinome. you've got some folks who, jumped in at Testament. And so Gun and Gun is like forgotten. And we'll see if that changes. I hope it does. I mean, Gun and Gun's a very competitive game, and it's a very fun game. It's very different from everything else that we've done. But it does play into a different market. It's probably the game that plays into the most, probably a different market than all the others. You would think that Embryo Machine and Gun had a lot of cross appeal, and certainly some people who backed Gun showed up for Embryo Machine. But when I look at the backer list of both games, I actually don't, and I cross reference them. I don't see as much. I don't see as many people as I expected to see in the Embryo campaign that also backed Gun. So again, Gun just, I think it's forgotten right now. But nevertheless, that's going to change for something that I'll talk about here in a second when I give the proper Gun update. But if you haven't checked out Gun definitely give it a shot. It's a super cool game, super fast playing game, very different. Someone says, once my stimulus check comes in, I might end up going through the catalog in the same way, saying, yeah, I mean, that's awesome. We would clearly very much appreciate that. Yeah, it's interesting starting from a newer game and then making your way back through. But yeah, so let's talk about Gun. I received exactly 0 updates about Gun from the printer this week. The frustration continues. I know they'll deliver. They're a good printer. They're well respected. A lot of big places use them, so they have that pedigree. But that doesn't make their lack of communication any less maddening. So I know they're working on those physical proofs, but we've been trying to get these physical proofs since January. I mean, late January. I guess you could call it February. February is probably more accurate, but nevertheless, we've been waiting on these physical proofs for a long time. And I know February, they're pretty much out of the office the entire month, even though we were led to believe that was not going to be the case, and it definitely was. And so if you look at it like that, you'd say, okay, well, it's like the 3rd week of March, so they've really only had about a month to get it together. But still, that's a long time. We submitted those files at the end of December. So it's frustrating. Someone asked on the Facebook today, when will Gun deliver? And of course, my hope is that we can deliver in May as intended. But I'll tell you what, that window to hit that delivery date is shrinking, and it's shrinking quickly by the day at this point, getting toward the end of March. Now, if I get those physical proofs and everything looks perfectly, and I highly doubt that's going to happen, by the way. I mean, it rarely does, where you get the physical proofs and you're like, all right, cool, they're done. Off to the press we go. I mean, that does happen. It's somewhat of a rarity. If that does happen, though, and let's say they got them to me, they arrive next week, so it'd be the end of March, they would be done with mass printing in April. And if they were able to get them onto a boat relatively quickly, we could see Gun arrive in the States in May, and maybe some people would get their games. Some, definitely not all. Some would get them in May. But, the rest would get them in June. But I am not super optimistic about being able to hit May at this point. I think a victory would be getting close to May right now. I mean, this process has taken so much longer than I expected, and I know that things are a lot slower right now. I mean, just because we're moving through this pandemic a little quicker this year, obviously, than we were just like 6 months ago. And although people are recovering in like the business world from having to adjust to all of this, things are still slow moving. I just wasn't quite expecting this company to be moving as slow as they currently are. That's ultimately why I went with them, because I had such a great experience with them in the past with our first project, and they were so quick. That's one of the reasons why I jumped from the printer who did Wild Hunt Festival to this one, because I was thinking, all right, they can do a quick turnaround time. I know them. They're respected. This is the right decision. And it's turned out not to be the wrong decision. It has turned out to be the slow decision. So if they can't print 1 copy in 1 month, you're very optimistic to think they can print thousands of copies the week you give them the okay. Well, not necessarily. there is sort of added incentive once you give someone the okay to hit mass production, because once they get that, it's essentially the click of a couple buttons. It might be a little bit more complicated than that, but not a ton. I mean, really, once you get those files taken care of and the physical proofs come back okay, the turnaround is fairly quick. Even in this constrained environment, the turnaround would be very quick. But you are right that it is optimistic thinking, which is why I'm being very soft in my language about that May delivery date and being able to achieve that, because it's, like I said, the window is shrinking and everything would have to line up more or less perfectly at this point to be able to begin shipping out to backers in May. I'm not saying it can't be done. It is possible. I'm just not very certain it's probable. So at this point, I'm trying to get as close to May as possible. With our first project, Sinome, we delivered within a month, and that felt pretty good. I'd like to be able to deliver within a month for a gun and gun. Some might even say that's optimistic right now, and I wouldn't refute that. But I think we can. I don't think we're going to have a huge delay like with Wild Hunt Festival. I don't think we're looking at a 6-month delay or a 5-month delay like we did with Wild Hunt Festival. But I think a 2-month delay is very realistic. I could be proven wrong. I've been wrong plenty of times before. But, just trying to read the tea leaves, I think that's probably where we're going to end up. Were you able to exchange with other publishers using this printer and waiting on were you able to exchange with other publishers using this printer? Oh, no, I did not, just because I had already used them before. I had been talking with this printer long before Gun and Gun ever even went to Kickstarter. And so I had talked with them 3 months, 4 months before the Kickstarter ever launched, just to kind of test them out, see where they were at, see if they were accepting new clients. Of course they were, but also just to see how they had been hit by the pandemic as well. And, I don't think I was sold a bill of goods necessarily, but I think they too, to use the word of the night, were maybe a little bit more optimistic or conveyed greater optimism than perhaps the situation actually called for. So I did reach out to other companies, but I didn't feel like I needed to, because I had done my homework. I had worked with them before. I had reached out to them plenty early in the process, and so I felt pretty good about having them on board. And they said that they could deliver, and we talked about the timeline. I told them May. They said okay, that shouldn't be an issue. They talked about the February holiday, the spring festival being an issue, but I mean, we dealt with that with Sinome as well, and we dealt with that with them, with Sinome, you know what I mean? And it wasn't as big of an issue with Sinome as it was this time, so I'm not quite sure what happened there either. But I felt pretty good using this one, and I felt good going into it. And they made me feel pretty reassured that this was the right decision. So, like I said, I don't think it was the wrong decision, but it's definitely it's the slow decision. So some other news about Gun and Gun is we are now hosting, thanks to Sin Theory, who's here in the chat, we are now hosting a Learn the Game night for Gun and Gun, and it's going to go down tomorrow night from 7 to 10 p.m. EST, utilizing Tabletop Simulator. So Sin Theory, one of our new community leads, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is going to be running folks through how to play the game. So this is a great way to get folks back thinking about Gun and Gun, because the Kickstarter ended in October. That was a while ago. People have moved on in their lives. So it's a great way to get people back, especially those who backed the project, thinking about Gun and Gun. Most people didn't check out the demo. I mean, when I look at the metrics and I look at how many people backed Gun and Gun's campaign, and then I look at how many people checked out the demo, I can clearly see that most people did not ever touch that demo. So there are a lot of people out there who have never actually played the game yet. And most of those folks won't play the game until the games show up, and then they're going to want to play it with the physical thing. I mean, that's kind of how I am. But I also know that there are people out there who want to learn the game before the game gets to them. And so that's why we're running this Learn the Game event. It's a great way to get those folks thinking about the game. It's a great way to get them to experience the game for the first time, but it also gives an opportunity for folks who have seen Gun and Gun and have watched Gun and Gun from the sidelines, but have never gotten on the field with it. And it might help them who maybe they're on the fence, because you can still late pledge to the game. It might help them decide, like, yeah, this game is for me, or it might help them decide, no, this game's definitely not for me. Either way, it's a net positive for the customer, because they get to find out, like, yep, this game's great, or nope, this is not my kind of thing. So it's a 3-hour block. If you wanna join, we actually have a link in the Discord, in the Gun and Gun channel in the Discord, that you can click on and you can sign up officially. That way Sin knows how many people are going to show up. But I also dropped that same link on social today, primarily on Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to go there, you can check out a tweet that I blasted out about 6 hours ago or 7 hours ago at this point, and you'll be able to find the sign up form there as well. So this is not like necessarily a one and done kind of thing. Now, it might be a one and done kind of thing for learning Gun and Gun, though my guess is we're going to come back to those learning nights for all of our games, Gun and Gun included. But this is going to set in motion something a little bit larger, and that is we are going to do 2 streaming nights. I don't have a hard date on when that's going to go into effect, but we will be streaming twice a week. Probably sometime in April, probably toward the end of April, but I'm not even committing to April. So I will just say sometime soon, we're going to be streaming twice a week. One of the streams will be this show, LionWing Talks. The other stream will be probably playing a LionWing game, be it Embryo Machine, be it Gun and Gun, be it Testament, be it Wild Hunt Festival, whatever the case may be. We might do it through Tabletop Sim. We might do it with cameras. I don't know. We want to stream our stuff, though, and we want to get folks involved. If they want to join in on the fun, absolutely, we invite you to do that. It's not like it's just the team who's going to be streaming. Now, that will be the case some weeks. It'll just be us streaming the game, or it just might be Sin and his group streaming the game, because obviously he and I are not in the same physical space. So utilizing his group to stream some of the game. I'll be streaming some of the games. We'll just be streaming LionWing stuff. But there will also be some times when we take a break from LionWing stuff and we just stream kind of our something else that we see as being a hot topic in the chat. So right now, Monster Hunter Rise has dominated a lot of the chat conversation. A lot of people in the Discord have really been looking forward to Rise, myself included. I've got my deluxe copy pre-ordered. I got on that the minute that it popped up on Amazon, but nevertheless, I know a lot of people are looking forward to that game, and so we might stream some stuff that's not related to LionWing at all, but would still be exciting to folks who are in the Discord. Because as I mentioned last week, and Sin was really the one who kind of brought this into focus when he and I and Beans were chatting in our team chat in the Discord. People who are part of Discord servers have more interest than just the one thing that brought them there. Y'all like more things than just LionWing stuff. So it's like, well, let's look at the stuff that most people like, and let's see if we can incorporate that into our community events. And that's one of the ways that we plan on doing that. So LionWing Talks and LionWing shows. I don't know if it'll be LionWing shows, but it will be LionWing something. That is the plan. There will be a little bit of wordplay that will continue in that regard. It'll probably be LionWing Plays. So you have LionWing Talks and LionWing Plays, and those will be our 2 primary shows. We talked about adding a third stream to the week, but I don't think we're quite there yet. That'll happen much further down the road. That'll probably be more relevant once people start getting their games in hand. So that's the plan. Yeah, someone said in the chat, yes, I love watching gameplays. Definitely looking forward to Gun and Gun. Might push me to lay back. Yeah, maybe it will. Check it out tomorrow. I mean, join in. I don't know how Sin is going to have that set up. I don't know if he's going to be streaming it. I don't know if he's going to be streaming it to the Twitch or streaming it just in the Discord, or if he's going to be streaming it at all. He might not do that. It really kind of depends on who shows up. So if you've been looking for an opportunity to check out one of our games that you haven't backed, and perhaps that game is Gun and Gun, then definitely jump in tomorrow night. Even if you don't necessarily want to play, you could still just kind of watch the whole thing go down. I would encourage folks to do that. So That's an update on Gun and Gun. Embryo Machine. So let's talk about Embryo Machine's latest. I mentioned before that, I was working on sort of another pass a couple days ago. Some other news, some other Embryo Machine news, though, is Arachne's STL file is almost complete, which is really exciting for, well, a couple reasons. So Arachne, some people think that Hystrix's model would / is probably the hardest one to sculpt, to render for a model. And in some ways, Hystrix's model presents some unique challenges because Hystrix has a lot of thin parts. For example, let's see. Yeah, so I've got Hystrix here right next to me. And I don't know how well that's going to show up, but nevertheless, it's right next to me. I figured I'd grab it. So he's got a lot of spikes coming off the top of him, right? And I don't know if those are going to print super well when someone goes to 3D print this bad boy. Nevertheless, we are going to be doing print tests to ensure that we don't need to fix anything. But because of that, I think people think that Hystrix's model is probably one of the harder ones to render. But having watched that process for Hystrix and having watched the process for Arachne, I would actually argue that Arachne's model has been a little bit harder, primarily because Arachne's positioning, primarily because Arachne's proportions and just sort of geometrical structure is very different. I mean, he walks differently. He's a horizontal mech, where every other mech in the game is a vertical mech, is a vertically oriented mech. That's not Arachne. He's got a lot of appendages, and it's hard to get those proportions just right. But what's the hardest part of all of these files is, other than the forward-facing graphics that we have on these mechs, we don't have any other reference art of how the bottom of their legs look, or the bottom of their feet look. We don't know what their backs look like. We don't know what their undersides look like. We only know what is presented to us on the unit boards and on the standees. And so we've had to create from scratch. No references from Cosaic or Group S&E, because they don't have them. So we've had to imagine what these things would look like, which has been the hardest part of the entire process. Putting together a render of Hystrix using the front of them is it's a fairly straightforward process. It's time consuming, but whatever, that's fine. But it's easy. Having to imagine, conceptualize what the rest of this mech might look like has been the hardest part. And certainly, Cosaic has provided us some reference points, but it's not like they can show us an illustration that we can then say, oh yeah, okay, that's what it looks like. And so we are having to make this up, which slows down the process, but it makes it incredibly difficult to figure out, what would the bottom of Arachne look like. And Arachne is especially challenging because you can more easily guess what a mech's backside would look like just by seeing their front. So we've had to do that with Arachne. We've had to imagine what the top portion of his model would look like. But then we've had to work with something that we haven't really had to work with yet with any of the other mechs, and that is, because Arachne is a horizontal mech, we have to imagine what the entire underside of him would look like, on top of the backs of his legs, on top of the bottoms of his feet, on top of having to figure out what the top of him looks like. You know what I mean? So he's had a lot more things to figure out than any of the other mechs. He's very close to being finished. So I would dare venture, with Hystrix out of the way and with Arachne close to being out of the way, from here on out, it's smooth sailing. Everyone else, all of the other Embryo machines should be easy to figure out, but Arachne has definitely been the most challenging part. I think the renderer has spent about 40 hours, close to 40 hours, rendering Arachne's digital model. He's spending about 30 hours. Like, he spent 30 hours on Hystrix. One of the ones he did early on, I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was Visner. I think he breezed through that pretty quickly because Visner is not a terribly complicated looking mech. And so I think he finished that in about 15 hours. But Arachne definitely has taken the most amount of time. But, it's important that we get this stuff right. I mean, it doesn't exactly like jazz me when I know that I'm paying someone a very high rate for 40 hours just to finish one model. At some point you're like, shit, is this even worth it? Like, did we even make enough money off these STL files to justify doing 9 of these? But at this point, we don't have a choice. We said we do it, so we're doing it. But with Arachne out of the way, I think the rest will be pretty simple. And I mean, I just love how these have turned out. Okay, so it's taken 40 hours, and okay, it's taken 30 hours for some, and okay, that's a lot of money, but they look awesome, and I hope people, I hope people make use of these. I hope they print them off, and I hope they use them, and I hope we see pictures of them being used in games. And I love the idea of being able to render these things and print them off on your own. And I will probably show off Arachne's model in the next update. That's my hope, but I don't know for certain just yet. I'm hoping to. I mean, we've got a long time between now and the delivery of Embryo Machine, so I've got to sort of have a roadmap of what I'm going to be showing in each of these updates, and you have to strategically kind of plan these out to ensure you've got something to talk about, for basically the next however many months, 7 or 8 months that it's going to be before the game's delivered. So you never want to kind of like show off everything right up front, because then it's like, well, shit, August comes around, I've got nothing to say, and and then you don't post an update, and people are like, what happened? Why haven't you posted in a month? And it's like, okay, now I've got to talk about why I didn't post for an entire month, and it's a whole thing. And so you just want to make sure that you're planning your updates very intentionally, and that you've got enough content to last you the entire time to keep people interested and engaged in your updates. What color will their pantsuits be? Can't reveal that information just yet, and it doesn't matter. You'll be able to paint them in whatever way you'd like. So, so that's Embryo Machine's update, and that kind of takes us to the end tonight. I said that this would be an abridged show, and perhaps an hour doesn't feel like an abridged show, but when you come off the heels of last week's show, which was 1 hour and 25 minutes, hitting about 55 minutes feels short. I can noticeably tell that I still have a voice, and that's how I know that I've spoken for less than an hour. Nevertheless, we do this every week, so we'll be coming back for episode 9 next week. I introduced in last week's show this idea of a topic, and last week's topic was the topic of some lore diving for Testament's Kickstarter bonus characters. And I mentioned I'm not going to be doing that sort of like topic spotlight in every show, and I probably won't even be doing a topic spotlight like that every other show. I'm going to just kind of do it whenever it feels right, and whenever I feel like I've got something really good to talk about for 20, 30 minutes. So I don't know when that next one will be, but I did get good feedback on that. It seemed that people enjoyed learning about the lore of those two characters. I'd like to also talk about some mechanics. So, I will probably talk about the mechanics of some of our games in some of these shows as well. I try not to talk too many mechanics in these LionWing Talks shows, because I'm not sure, like, I'm trying to cast a wide net with these shows. People who watch these may only be watching for one game or two games, but not all four or something like that. So I've got to make sure that I'm never drilling down too deep on one game if I can help it, because I know that I've got to provide updates on many games. Now, the only exception there would be on those topic spotlight weeks, where I'm definitely going to be drilling down on one game. And in those times, I probably will be talking more specifically about mechanics of one game or another. But I've been kind of holding back also. I've also been holding back on getting into the mechanical nature of the games until the games are in people's hands. Like, I can talk about a game mechanically. I can talk about gun and gun mechanically right now. But most people, as I said before, haven't checked out the demo, haven't checked out the tabletop simulator version, aren't ever going to check out those things, and they're only going to know the game once they play it. And then once they play it, they might come into the Discord or they might tune into one of these shows. And then it makes sense to really talk about the mechanics of Gun and Gun, because people will have questions about those things, or they'll want to hear strategy because they themselves have been playing it. But until you get the game in your hand, it's kind of like, I mean, you could talk mechanics to me all day, but I don't know. I've never played the game, so like none of this stuff really means anything. And because of that, I don't really care a whole lot. So that's the only reason why I haven't done that. Now, you'll see in some of the games as Kickstarter updates, I do dive into that stuff, but that kind of makes sense, right? I'm going to talk about some mechanics in a Gun and Gun Kickstarter update because everyone who's reading that update backed the game. So it makes a little bit more sense there, but you still have the issue of most people don't even read those updates. I mean, when you look at the click-through rate, most people don't read those things. But even the folks that do, they still don't have a point of reference if they don't have the game in their hand. So you can talk about mechanics there, and perhaps there's a greater ratio of people who care in that kind of environment than those who would come to this type of environment to learn about mechanics or hear about mechanics. But still, the games aren't in hand, so it's harder for people to connect with that kind of conversation when they haven't played the game themselves. But I do want to incorporate some of that stuff through our topic spotlights, and I will. I think that'll be fun. And based on the feedback that I got about Testament last week, I think that's, people will enjoy that kind of thing. Or maybe people just really love Testament, and that's why I got a good feedback on last week's show. We'll find out, because it's not like I'm just going to be sticking to Testament when it comes to my topic spotlights. I'm going to be hitting, all of our games, and, I'll rotate back to Testament at some point, of course. But not for a little bit, since I just dedicated like 30 minutes of last week's show to just talking about some Testament characters. Someone in the chat said, "Hey, I'm team mechanics." Yeah, no, I am too. I mean, like I said, most of these games I know extremely well because I was either directly involved in the editing process or the playtesting process. So I feel like I have a good understanding of them. Now there are, for instance, Gun and Gun, I haven't played, like seriously played Gun and Gun since like the end of last year. I've gone, like when we were finishing up the assets and I was doing my final pass of everything, which was like November, December, I went back and played a couple games just to make sure that when I was going back and tightening up all the language in the cards, making sure that I had all the language exactly as I wanted it to. Now, of course, once I get the final games or something, I know I'm going to go through the assets and be like, fuck, why did I say that, not that? But that's just life. Nevertheless, I haven't really played it much since I closed the books on that game's production. And that's kind of how I work, honestly. So with Embryo Machine, once we're done with all the asset reviews and we've inserted the text and I proofed the damn thing, and now, fortunately, I'm usually not the only one proofing. I'm usually like the secondary proofer. I have someone who's like, this is what they do. But nevertheless, once we deem that Embryo Machine is complete and the files go off to the printer, I probably won't touch Embryo Machine for a long time for two reasons. One is it's time to move on to the next thing. I've got to shift focus and I got to get to the next game. I mean, I'm already doing that in addition to, working on Embryo Machine. I've got my hands in multiple other projects, but definitely once Embryo Machine is wrapped, then I'm in a lot of other projects. But also, up until you get those assets just right, and up until you send those files off, they've been submitted to the printer and everything looks good, it's kind of one of those things where it's, for me anywhere, I'm like, I don't want to see this game for a long time. Like, I don't want to touch it. I don't want to hear its name. I don't want to see it. I don't want to play it. I don't want to look at another damn rule book about this game. And so I definitely need like a break from the games where I'm like heavily involved, but even the games where I'm not heavily involved, where maybe I'm just like doing some spot checks or whatever, by the time it comes to send those babies off to the printer, I'm like, all right, I need to stop looking at this game for a while. You all see the game once it gets announced, and you really see the game once the Kickstarter hits. But for Embryo Machine, I'm just using Embryo Machine as an example. Y'all saw that game for the first time kind of in January, but mostly in February. But I've been working on that damn game since, early 2020. I'm like, all right, I've seen Embryo Machine a whole lot of times. I'm kind of ready not to see Embryo Machine for a little bit. So, yes, someone in the chat said, lol, # publisher fatigue. It's fucking real. it's real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You see a game and you live and breathe a game for so long that once you finally get the opportunity to like get that game as far away from you as possible, you take it. You should always take it. It's also why you never work in a vacuum. It's also why you make sure that you have a good team, because fatigue is real. I mean, project fatigue is real in any environment, in any industry, any type of project. It's real, and it's definitely real here. And so when you've got a team of people, you can sort of share some of that fatigue, and you can spread it around. That way, no one's feeling, you know, overburdened with it. Because once you get to that stage, you're not going to do good work on that project. You're not going to contribute any longer. You're actually probably going to be a detriment to the process. You're going to be a detriment to the project, and you never want that to happen. So you want a team. I always make sure we've got a good team. There's usually 3 or 4 of us dedicated, you know, to one game or whatever. But sometimes you do catch a project where it's a smaller team and you're kind of bearing a larger load than you typically would, than when you would have a larger team, that kind of thing. So Embryo's team has been pretty small. So there's been a core of 3 of us. So yeah, I'm kind of getting on Embryo Machine. I'm like, all right, cool. How many more times I got to look at this text? Couple more times. Are we sure? Can I be done with it already? But you can't be. That's the way it goes. And you know that getting into this line of work, and you either accept it or you say it's not for me. So clearly I accepted it a long time ago, but nevertheless, I'll be glad when it's done. For possible talk topics, someone said, would love to hear more in regards to the thought processes as the head of a publisher of how you pick up projects and how you get the ball rolling with your team. Yeah, so a lot of people like to hear about the scouting process. I think I've talked about the scouting process at least twice, 2 different episodes where I've talked about that. One was I went pretty in depth, and one of the first shows, it was like episode 1 or 2. And then I touched on it again, and maybe like episode 4 or 5 or something. So it is something that people like to hear about. And each time that I talk about it, I certainly will say some of the same things, but I try to offer some new bits of information that I didn't share last time, because I do think you can talk about the same topic multiple times, but sort of inject new life into it each time you talk about it by taking a slightly different, you know, approach to discussing it, and maybe you focus on something different the next time you talk about it. So yeah, it's something that people are interested in, and it always is sort of, it's an ever changing art. I mean, the types of games that I scout all sort of have commonalities, and how I go about scouting, the actual process of finding games, is pretty similar. But the process of how I decide between 2 games that I really like, I mean, that's a process that I haven't really shared. You know, when I'm presented with Embryo Machine, which obviously I loved because it was a project that we took to Kickstarter, at the same time that I took on Embryo Machine, there was another game that was competing that could have been in Embryo Machine's place. Now, it ultimately wasn't. I chose Embryo Machine over it. But that is something that I haven't really shared. You know, what do I ultimately look for? I've talked more specifically, like the types of games that I look for, and you know, how I like to publish games that I personally like, and I personally would play. But I haven't really talked about like what happens if you find multiple games that you like and multiple games that you would play. You're one publisher. You can't possibly publish every game you would ever want to publish. So how do you get into the nitty gritty of discerning which one you're finally going to pick up and which one you're going to have to let go? Sometimes it's very sad to let go of something, you know. Once it gets to the point, almost invariably, every time that I'm scouting a game, almost every time I get to 2 games. It's like, at this point, I've done it so many damn times that I have just built it into my expectations that ultimately I'm going to be deciding between 2 games. Rarely do I I'm scouting games and I'm like, that's the one and I know it and I only want that one. Usually I'm like, I really want that game, and I really like that game, and I really like that game, and I think I like that game too. And that one seems pretty promising. I should probably order that and play it. You know, so that happens, and then I'll kind of narrow it down, and you know, I typically am deciding between 2 games. So maybe I'll talk about what it's like to have to make that final move. There's anxiety that comes along with having to finally commit to one game. And like I said, there's a little bit of like sadness of letting go of a game that you know you're not going to publish. Especially at this point. I mean, we have our tentative release schedule planned out through the end of 2022. 2022 is next year, right? I don't know. Time means nothing anymore. I think next year's 2022. If it is, we have our release schedule planned out basically through the end of that. So games that I see now, I'm like, all right, if I find a game that I really love right now, I have to go and I have to convince that designer, I really want your game, but I'm going to have to like have it stuck in a queue for the next 2 years. Are you okay with that? Or I'm going to have to offer some sort of incentive for them to say like, yeah, let's do this, but I don't want to just not collect on what could be royalties from another company if you're telling me you want this, but it's going to take you 2.5 years to get to it. So that's a whole thing. So you can either, at this point, it's like, all right, I can talk about 2023 with some games, or it's one of those situations where it's like, I have to have this game. I have to figure out where I'm going to fit this in. How do I go about doing that? Projects are ever changing. Sometimes you have big hopes for a project and you have an idea in your head of when you're going to release it, and then something happens and that contract dissolves either by the designer or you as the publisher decide, you know what, at the time, when I wanted to publish this game, things were very different. Things could mean anything. It could be a number of things, but things were very different then. Things have now changed. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to publish this game in the same way that it once made sense for us to do it. And so, we're going to have to walk away from this project. And that does happen. That happens in every line of work with every company ever who is working with products that someone designs for them. And even though people aren't designing products for us, it sort of works in the same way, though. I think I mentioned last week, or maybe it was the week before that, you don't want to do that too many times. Word travels fast, especially in the Japanese tabletop scene. It's only so big. You do that a couple of times, word gets around, hey, they're unreliable. They'll sign a contract with you, and then they'll dissolve the contract 8 months, 18 months later. Be careful. So you want to be mindful of that kind of thing. And at the same time, I have a business to look out for. And if I decide, you know what, this is the better business move for LionWing, more people are going to be interested in this than this thing, even though I wanted this thing at one point in time. I mean, I run a business. I got to do what's best for the business. And if that means I got to pivot away from that thing that I once was convinced was the thing that I needed to this new thing where I'm like, actually, this is going to do better and this is what the market's calling for right now, then you better believe I'm going to make that pivot. And, we try to, if that happens, we try to make sure that, the game that we had to turn away from, that we maintain that relationship in the best way possible, and that we compensate someone for their time. But that's business, and it happens. So, if I find a game at this point, those are my two options. All right, cool. 2023, or does this make more sense instead of something that I've already got lined up? The problem for us right now is we've got so many damn cool projects lined up that I'm not even that isn't an option right now. I'm not able to bump projects right now because every project that we've got lined up for the rest of this year and through 2022 is a project that I'm firmly behind. Now, if you watch the previous shows, you know that I might swap the placing of some of our projects. What was going to be our fall project is going to be our summer project, and what was going to be our summer project is now our fall project. That kind of thing happens frequently, and most people are cool with that. Most designers or whatever, they're like, oh yeah, fine. If you got to wait like 3 or 6 extra months, 8 months, whatever, as long as you get to it, cool. So that kind of thing can happen. But at this point, I'm not really in a place where I'm willing to bump or let go of projects that we already have in place over the next 18 months, just because they're too good. So yeah, that's a little bit about that. So I would gladly talk about that topic more. Rogue, in the chat, you asked that question. If you ever want to know specific things about that topic, drop them in the LionWing Talks Q&A channel in the Discord, and I will make sure that I answer them. As perhaps I've indicated here, I try to answer these things with complete transparency, with 100% honesty, in ways that, you won't find elsewhere. And so if you want to get specific and you really want to get into the nitty gritty of something, of a topic, and if that's the topic, go ahead and ask the question and be as specific as you want. Now, I will say, if it ever gets to a point where someone asks a question and I'm like, I don't want to answer that question, I'm just going to straight tell you, like, that's not really for you to know. I'm going to keep that information for me. But most of the time, I'm very open with all of this stuff. So, yeah, possible solution: create a sister publishing company, release all the games. Yeah, I mean, that happens all the time. People, create subsidiary companies, or they create different sort of departments within their company, and they give it a different name, even though it's under the same banner. It's not a subsidiary; it's still under the same banner, but it sort of operates a little bit independently of the main company. That happens. Subsidiaries are quite common, especially if you're going to be releasing games that like don't really make a lot of sense with what your core company does. Like if we wanted to release, hardcore Euros with a traditional Euro art style, like that would never make sense for LionWing. So maybe I wouldn't do this for Euros, but maybe it makes sense. Then you open up a subsidiary company that focuses on this other thing, because LionWing's mission is very clearly stated one, and so it wouldn't make a lot of sense to try to release that kind of game under the LionWing banner. So companies do that quite often. Companies also do that with different types of products in the tabletop industry, where they'll create a subsidiary company for a very specific type of tabletop game. Maybe it's a war game, maybe it's a tabletop RPG or whatever. Now, there are plenty of companies out there that just do the department thing. Like one main company, you release card games, you release board games, you release miniatures games, you release RPGs, and it's all under the one banner, but it's sort of, each department acts a little differently. And I think of Fantasy Flight Games, who kind of publishes everything, and there are like plenty of publishers that publish everything. But they're the first ones that just always come to my mind, because I generally like Fantasy Flight, so I think of them often in these examples. Nevertheless, yes. Someone in the chat said, my ears perked up. Your ears perked up with what? Tell me what that means. I need to know what it means. Don't leave me hanging. That's so vague. And to go back to Rogue, your second part, I think you had a second part. Would love to hear more about thought process as the publisher. Oh, yeah, and how you get the ball rolling with your team. That's not something that I've really talked about. I've done 2 streams. With the graphic designers of Gun and Gun and Embryo Machine, respectively, where we've talked about kind of our process of localizing those games, and people really liked those. And I plan to do that type of thing literally for every project that we have scheduled for a Kickstarter. We will be doing a stream where it's the graphic designer and I sitting down to talk about what the localization process was like. Or if I wasn't really involved in the localization process, I'll bring in the main editor who was. But a lot of the games I'm usually involved in some way in the localization process, so I feel pretty qualified to talk about how things worked and what we had to do and the hurdles that we faced and the successes that we had and the challenges that we had to confront, that kind of thing. So we'll continue doing that. But certainly, if you want to hear more about how the team dynamics work and how we communicate and how we prioritize and, what we tackle first, what we leave to the end, that kind of thing, I'll gladly talk about that as well. I just ask of people, if you really want to know something, this goes back to something I said before, if you really want to know something specific, get specific with me. Ask the specific question, and therefore I will give you a specific answer every time, I promise. Talking, as you can see, is not something that comes challenging to me, because before I talked for 55 minutes, 20 minutes have since elapsed since I said that we were going to be wrapping up the episode. So clearly I can talk for a while if I need to. I didn't actually need to do that tonight, but I just kind of got off on a tangent. Here we are, which also happens quite frequently in these shows. That's why they're so damn long. These never end on time. You're right, Sin Theory. They never end on time. When I started these things, I think in the first episode or two, I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be like a 30-minute chat, maybe 60 minutes on an off day. And it's like, no, on an off day, there's 60 minutes. And most of the time they're an hour and 15 minutes. And then you have some weeks like last week where they're an hour and 25 minutes pushing an hour and 30. So you're right. They never do end on time. That's why I don't even anymore. I don't even say when they're going to end. Like if they end at 10:30, they end at 10:30, and that's exactly when it was supposed to end. If they end at 9:55, like it could have ended 20 minutes ago, then that would have been exactly when this episode needed to end. But since we're now approaching 10:20, I'm guessing that it's 10:20. That's when this episode needs to end. We've half the number of questions and double the time taken. You're right. You're good at math. I am not. I'm glad you pointed that out. I think we had far less than half. I mean, most of the time we've got like somewhere between 6 and 8 questions. Officially, we only had one question tonight. How these things work, I don't even know anymore. But I'm glad to sit here and chat with you guys for however long you want to talk. If it's 90 minutes, it's 90 minutes. If it's 60 minutes, it's 60 minutes. If it's 25 minutes one week, then it's 25 one week. I'm cool with just hanging out and talking and shooting the breeze with everyone and answering questions that come up in the chat. That's why I always invite people to join the chat. That's why I send out tweets or Facebook posts when we're about to go live, because I do like the engagement. I like being able to answer questions right then and there. And as I've said many times before, I love being put on the spot. I don't like having a lot of time to prep for an answer. I think it creates sort of inauthenticity, and I don't like that. I like having to answer it in real time and think on my feet, because you get the best, most honest answer when that happens, especially with me, because when I have to think on my feet, I can't bullshit my way through an answer. The only thing I can give you is the truth, because it's the only thing that's going to come to my head in time to actually spit out an answer in a timely manner of when you ask the question and when I answer it. So there you have it. That does take us to the end, though. I think that's the end for today. I appreciate everyone jumping in the chat. We had quite a bit of folks talking and asking questions and saying things in the chat, which I love. Someone just said, super enjoy this format and engagement. I'm glad you do. And I'm glad that this could be your first episode. And it seems like it maybe made a good impression, and that's fantastic. Hopefully you come back for next week's episode, or, whenever you've got the time to. Loved having you in the chat, Rogue. Much appreciated. And of course, to all of our regulars, thank you. As always, y'all are awesome. Join us tomorrow in the Discord for some learning time for Gun and Gun. I think it'll be a good time. Really excited to see Sin kind of take the reins on that and get that going. So if we've got nothing else and we don't have anything else, then our time here is done. Thank you all. We'll be back next week, same time, Wednesday, 9 p.m. EST here on Twitch. Looking forward to it. I will see you then, folks.